everybody. I'm Ben Greene. I'm a sophomore here at Brandeis. I'm a future teacher. I'm an actor. I'm a stand-up comic. And I'm an openly transgender man. What this means is that I spent around 16 years as an ugly and uncomfortable girl. Then I learned what trans meant from a Facebook post, and everything changed. No, I didn't have the typical trans experience growing up. When we played family, I was never the dad. I was actually always the magical talking dog, and thank God that didn't foreshadow anything. Now, I want to make one thing clear. I am one trans person out of over 1 million in the US alone. I'm here sharing one story and one set of opinions out of over 1 million unique stories and opinions. Now, we'll get a little more into it later, but to get started, I want to give you all a quick spark notes on how the beginning of my transition went. I spent the most of the beginning of my life, feeling kind of uncomfortable in myself, but not knowing what it was or what it meant until the summer before my junior year of high school. All I knew was that if I stood in front of a mirror and looked into my eyes long enough, I stopped being able to recognize the person who was looking back at me. I knew something wasn't right. One day I saw a coming out post, did a couple more hours of research on my own, and realized that what wasn't sitting right was being a girl. I came out to some of my close friends, but spent the majority of that year deep in the closet to my friends, my family, and to my school. I got most of my support that year from a secret online underground support network for LGBT teens for the whole state of Connecticut. I didn't come out until the fall of my senior year when I got into a major car accident and said to myself that night, well, nothing will ever be as scary as that, and I came out on Facebook. As I got to be more comfortable with myself, other people became more comfortable with me too. I was one of only 2 trans students at my high school who were public about it, so a lot of people had questions that had gone unanswered. I started answering these questions by guest speaking in classes or meeting with my school's administration. I even ended up getting picked as the president of that same LGBT support network that had helped keep me above water for most of my junior year. People also became comfortable asking me more personal questions too. Blossoming members of the LGBT community would talk to me, text me, call me, and once I got to college, even show up at my door with questions they didn't know how to begin to answer, and we'd figure them out together. So far, this has been a really incredible journey, and I'm really excited to share with you all some things I've picked up along the way. Now, throughout the talk, I'm going to be giving you all some tips on how to be a good ally to the trans people you already know or the ones you'll meet in the future. Here's our first tip. Don't stop learning. Yes, I love public speaking, but it isn't the job of all trans people to train and educate you on every possible concept and situation. There are thousands of resources online, at schools, in more and more companies, and elsewhere that are great ways to continue to learn things to be a better ally. Watch YouTube videos, look at websites like the Human Rights Campaign, read a book by a trans author, or watch a TV show with a trans character like The Fosters. Just keep learning. Before we really get into the meat of it, I want to go over some vocab words that we're going to be using quite a lot in this talk. First, let's talk about your sex and your gender. Your sex, that's purely biological. We all remember middle school biology. It's whether a person was born with XX or XY chromosomes. Some people are born with a different set of chromosomes by being born as something called intersex as well. Your gender identity, on the other hand, that's a little more complicated. That is an identity. It's inside your head and inside your heart. That's what we're really here to talk about today. We'll go a little more into the science behind gender later, but for right now, let's start to talk about some of the different identities a person can have. I came up with this analogy my junior year of high school for a project for my health class, and I later gave the same presentation to my school's administration and to our sophomore year health classes, introducing trans topics to our curriculum for the first time ever. So remember too, this is just an analogy. It isn't going to line up perfectly, it's just one way to try and understand this concept. So, let's imagine that, for simplicity's sake, when people are born, they're born into one of 2 types of chairs. Firm, tall stools and soft, squishy armchairs. Now, when you first sit down in a chair, you feel it, right? You're like, ooh, something's touching my butt. But if it's comfortable, you stop feeling it after a little while. Most people don't feel their chairs. They are comfortable and content to stay in their chair for all of time. These people identify as what's called cisgender, which means having a gender identity that is the same as your biological sex. Now, if you're uncomfortable in the chair you're sitting in, you feel that chair constantly. You are really aware of that chair. This feeling of discomfort due to a mismatch between your gender identity and your sex is what's known as gender dysphoria, and it's the worst. So, if you're uncomfortable in the chair you're sitting in, what's the easiest solution? You just get up and you move to a different, more comfortable chair. 2 things to note about the way I move my chair. 1, watch the way I move from one chair to another. I'm not kicking over anybody else's chair. I'm not saying nobody's allowed to sit in a stool because I don't like stools. I just want to sit in a chair that's more comfortable for me. And second, I'm the same person sitting in this chair as I was sitting in that chair. I'm just more comfortable. So this explains the most binary of identities, but we've learned that there are a lot more ways to identify than just male or female. Gender is a spectrum from male to female, and people can identify anywhere along that spectrum they want. So people who don't identify as male or female fall under the umbrella term non-binary, meaning, you guessed it, not one of the 2 binary genders, being male or female. So how does this fit into our analogy? Well, maybe somebody wants to sit in a chair that's a little bit softer than a stool, but a little bit taller than a squishy chair. Maybe somebody wants to sit in one type of chair one day and a different type of chair a different day. Maybe somebody says, I just don't get it. Whatever chair I sit in, I'm uncomfortable. I would rather just stand up. People can identify as gender fluid, gender neutral, or a whole host of other identities. Some people may go by a different name, different pronouns, or go through medical changes. The most important thing to note is that there's no right or wrong way to identify as anything. All that matters is that you're comfortable where you're sitting. This brings us to our second good ally tip. There is no chair police, and more specifically, you are not the chair police. It is no one's place to say what kind of chair a person can sit in or how they can sit in it. So if someone asks you to call them a different name or different pronouns, don't make a big deal about how hard it is for you. Instead, stop for a moment and think about how much harder it probably is for the person you just called the wrong name. Apologize and move on. Don't say things like, you can't be a boy, you painted your nails, or you're trans, but you haven't had surgery. Again, there's no right or wrong way to identify as anything. Now, I know what you're probably thinking. Okay, Ben, this is nice and all, but we're talking a lot about feelings. How do I know this stuff is real? To which I say, 1, people's feelings are just as real and valid as the science behind it. And 2, it is real. Let's go into some science. There was a study conducted by a group in the Netherlands that focused on something called the bed nucleus of the stria terminalis, or BST for short. The main function of the BST is in controlling anxiety, but it has the notable characteristic of being, on average, twice as large in men as it is in women. Now, when researchers tested the sizes of this bed nucleus in transgender men and women, they found that when they compared those results to the sizes and densities of cisgender men and women, it lined up with the gender that people identified with and not with their biological sex. So what this would mean is that if they tested the BST of someone like me, who identifies as male, they would find that I have a size and density that very closely resembles someone who was born into a male body. To account for the fact that a lot of trans people may go on hormones that significantly alter their body chemistry, they later redid the study with people who weren't on hormones and found the same conclusions. There have been dozens of studies of this nature over the past couple of decades, and they have all pointed towards the same thing, that there are areas of the brain that are differentiated between male and female, and those differences are based on your gender identity and not your sex. As fascinating as the science behind gender is, I can only ask a bio major to explain so many big words to me. So let's go back into some more familiar territory. What I just did there is good ally tip number 3. It's okay to admit you don't know something. There is a ton of terminology and vocab, and it's really hard to keep track of. Even I sometimes hear things that I'm not familiar with, and I just look them up or ask someone about it. There's no shame in not knowing. It's especially hard to keep track of what's right and wrong when many mainstream news sources use incorrect phrases like transgendered. The correct phrase, by the way, is trans people, or people who are transgender. So, just ask. It's okay to not know something. Now, as hard as it may be to believe, I haven't always been this happy, or this comfortable, or this natural, and it certainly hasn't been easy to get here. I think the only way to truly explain what it's taken for me to get here is to tell you my story from the beginning. It's my junior year of high school. It's winter. I'm a newly minted member of the trans community, and I am scared out of my mind. I have anxiety, so I managed to convince myself that if I ever came out, literally everyone would hate me and everything would be awful. I got more and more scared, felt more and more uncomfortable, and eventually got to a point where I couldn't see a reason to continue to be alive. The road ahead seemed so long, so dark, and so rocky that I just didn't want to keep walking down it. I told my best friend about these thoughts, and he told my parents, who decided to take me to a hospital to see if I needed some more serious help. I spent the whole car ride there drafting up the text I was going to send to my best friend, ending our friendship forever because of how he had betrayed my trust. I got to the hospital at around 11:30 p.m., and I wasn't 18 yet, so they brought me to a locked pediatric emergency ward. They took away all the comfort items I had, and I went and sat by myself in a room with 3 walls, a curtain, and no clock. After a minute or two, a nurse came in and asked me what had been going on. I told her that I was trans and I was uncomfortable and I was scared and I just didn't want to do it anymore. She listened, took a few notes, and left. At this point in the story, I'm going to tell you 2 things. I'm going to tell you the facts of what happened to me, and I'm going to tell you the way that I interpreted it. Feel free to interpret it any way that you like. After a minute or two, a guy pulled open the curtain. He was wearing a cool leather jacket and street clothes, which no one else in that part of the hospital was allowed to wear. And he pulled open my curtain, and he looked at me and he said, "Hey, I heard what you said, and I just wanted to let you know that as long as you stay true to who you are, everything is going to be all right for you in the end." And then he left. I got up to thank him. I went out, and there was no one in the hall. The way that I interpreted this event was that this guy was some kind of sign, some way the universe was letting me know that I am lucky, that I'm on my second chance now, and that everything is going to be all right for me as long as I do everything I can to make the most out of being alive. From that point on, everything was different. I decided nothing was going to be as important as connecting genuinely and deeply with other people and with myself. When I left that hospital, things didn't get easier right away. They stayed hard for a while, and they still get hard sometimes. I went to a lot of therapy, I talked to my friends, I came out to my family, and I leaned on them. And with all of that amazing support, I managed to make it far enough down that road that I was walking in the light. Today, I can confidently look at you all and say that I am the happiest I have ever been in my entire life. And the me I'm going to be tomorrow is going to be even happier than that. I spend time appreciating every beautiful thing and person that the world has to offer, and I am so much better for it. So there you have it. That is why I am the way I am. This brings us to our last good ally tip. Listen to trans people. Like I said, I am one trans person, and the things that make me feel better might not help another person in the same way. If you want to know how to support someone in the way that helps them the best, ask them what that is. As an example, some people like it if you correct others when they mess up their name. Others feel uncomfortable about it and would prefer to do so themselves. Just ask. To summarize the 4 good ally tips we've covered: 1, don't stop learning. 2, it is no one's place to dictate how a person can or should identify except that person. 3, it's okay to admit you don't know something. And 4, listen to trans people. One final note about learning. If you have a question that you want to ask a trans person, first, ask if it's okay if you ask that question. We don't all want to be walking encyclopedias all the time. Second, think about how you would feel if that question was asked to you. Trans people often get asked extremely personal questions, sometimes by people we barely know. So think about your relationship to that person, and think about the situation that you're in. Could I ask you about your genitals? Or if you've gotten any surgeries recently? You get the point. Just think before you ask. Before I go, I want to leave you all with one final story to explain why I want to be up here speaking so much. Last summer, I saw a trans man on stage for the first time. His name was Ian Harvey. After the show, I stood in the lobby and I waited for him to come out, and I planned out everything I was going to say to him in my head. I was going to say, "I've never seen someone like me on a stage before. This was incredible, and it's given me so much hope for myself as a trans actor. Thank you." And I was going to ask him to sign my playbill. He finally came out. I opened my mouth, and I burst into tears. He took one look at me and started crying just as much. He pulled me in, and we stood there, hugging each other, understanding each other for 3 or 4 minutes. We finally stepped back, and he told me about how he had had the same experience the first time he saw a trans person on stage. So that's why I'm here. I want to keep that cycle going and be that for someone else. So I'm going to keep talking, keep acting, and most importantly, keep being the version of myself I never thought I would get to be, with authenticity, pride, and the biggest damn smile you've ever seen. When I first came out, being trans was the biggest part of my identity. I was a trans person who happened to be Ben. As I grew to be more comfortable in myself and learned that I don't have to put myself into any kind of box, I became Ben who happens to be a trans person. I am a million things before I'm trans, and that's totally okay. There is no right or wrong way to be trans. There's no right or wrong way to be any identity, and there's no right or wrong way to be yourself. All that matters is that you feel comfortable where you're sitting. Thank you.